Good evening, and welcome to Tales from Perdition. This is Angel's Tale, Chapter 3, Chekhov. Everything came flooding back. Her ears were ringing as she lay on the ground, waiting to die. Her mind was swimming, her focus lost. She looked up, saw a familiar desert where uniformed bodies lay scattered on the sands. Some writhed in agony, while others never made a sound. Black hawks circled above, surveying the wreckage below. Rihanna tried to lift herself up, but she didn't have any strength left in her. Don't leave us, she pleaded. She heard the rumble of armored vehicles from a few blocks away. You're pathetic, a familiar feminine voice answers. Her voice, however, wasn't hiding among the bodies, instead reverberating from everywhere at once. Who said that? Rihanna demanded, baring tenacious teeth to facade how powerless she truly was. Her demands were only met by silence. Rihanna looked around, gasping, when she saw a familiar-looking woman in her early 30s standing amongst the carnage. The older woman had dark brown hair and blue eyes tied into a ponytail. Rihanna held back her tears. A pang of disdainful recognition overtook her. Her own words died in her throat as this woman taunted her. Look at you, broken and powerless. You can't even stand on your own feet. Rihanna grit her teeth and pushed her body to stand. Every time she came close to getting upright, her body felt like it was being pulled back to the earth. Why do you keep trying? The woman taunted. Her words dug into Rihanna, hearing that phrase said from that voice. Rihanna was prone once more, instead looking up at the woman. Go away, Rihanna manages to force out. The woman smiles in response and shakes her head. You still don't get it. Rihanna looked at her confused and shook her head slightly. They all had families, Rihanna. Rihanna bit down on her lip, almost drawing blood. A chill ran down her spine when the woman said her name. Harper, Felix, Vanessa, Joseph. The woman coldly lists off a host of names, each one dug into Rihanna's skin like a bullet. Shut up. Don't you talk about them. Rihanna opened her eyes to glare at her. The fire in her eyes faded away when she saw more familiar figures in uniform staring back at her. Rihanna finally found the strength to stand. She reached for her thigh holster, drawing her M11 and racking the slide of her sidearm. Had they finally come for her, to punish her for her failure? She aimed her sidearm at the familiar figures. Her weapon shook in her hands as she aimed down the sights at her friends. One of the figures stepped forward, her hazel eyes glancing at the gun in her hands, then to Rihanna herself. Are you gonna shoot us, Kelly? Vanessa looked at her warily. Rihanna lowered her sidearm slowly and shook her head. Vanessa gave her a small smile and carefully stepped forward. Her hands opened to show she didn't have anything in her hands. Rihanna took a step back from her cautiously. Vanessa took note of this and halted her approach. Rihanna, could you please slide that over to me? Vanessa asked her gently. Rihanna slowly nodded and set the pistol down and slid it over to Vanessa. The former medic unloaded and cleared the barrel. She tossed aside both the weapon and ammo away from Rihanna. Rihanna collapsed onto her knees. Vanessa closed the gap and kneeled down to look into her eyes. Callie? Rihanna looked to Vanessa again. She gives her a sheepish smile and puts a hand on her shoulder. It wasn't your fault. We don't blame you for what happened. Rihanna averts her eyes and shakes her head. Vanessa's gaze softened as she looked at her. I know. You've been through a lot. What matters is we've got your back. Part of our oath, you know. Rihanna nodded slightly. Vanessa looked up as the steady sound of a heartbeat monitor beeping filled the air. You should probably get going. They still need you out there. Vanessa helped Rihanna to her feet. The fabric of her dream began to fall apart. The faces of those she once knew faded away as she was pulled back into reality. The bodies in sand fell to nothing as the harsh beeps of the heartbeat monitor resolved to deeper relief. Riona's eyes shot open as she looked around her surroundings warily. She looked around to see the sparsely decorated infirmary. A young nurse nearby notices Riona waking up. She walks to her bedside with a clipboard in hand, checking off a few boxes and taking notes with her pen. When she diverts her attention away from the clipboard, she asks, "How are you feeling, Miss Kelly?" Riona ran her hands through her hair and nodded. "Fine, just a bad dream," she replied. The young nurse hums in response, marking a few more boxes on her form. "How long was I out?" The nurse glances down at her watch. "Since last night. It's about 9:23 now." Riona sighs and glances over at the nurse. "Do I have a concussion?" she asks. The nurse shook her head in response, earning a sigh of relief from Riona. "Nope, your helmet took most of the impact. It's not made of standard Kevlar, I take it?" Riona shakes her head. "No, it's more of a riot helmet than it is a ballistic one." The nurse smiles and finishes taking notes. "Good thing you had it on then. Surprised you're able to wear them all the time. They're pretty heavy." Riona shrugs and looks down at herself. "Guess that's the benefit of being a freak of nature." She gives the nurse a meek smile, who awkwardly returns a similar pleasantry, unsure of how to reply. "We did notice you have a much higher muscle density than what should be possible for a human. Is that your mutation?" "It's part of it," Riona says, running a hand over her bicep. She flexes her arm, tracing a vein circulating her strange blood through her strange body. Riona tenses again before addressing the nurse, timid for a moment before asking, "Do you know where my gear is?" The nurse gestures to the foot of the bed where a locked trunk rests. She sees to unlocking it while Riona signs the forms the nurse had been scrawling on. Riona then trades her forms for her gear and clothing, thanking the nurse before departing. She walks outside with her gear slung over her shoulder. She squinted her eyes at the bright morning light. The outpost was back to its usual hustle, wayfinders going in and out on business of their own. The outpost seemed to be on higher alert after last night's attack. More guards are on duty watching the perimeter. A creature was still out there, whatever it was. Images of the maimed body she saw last night flashed in her mind. She grimaced, hoping it was quick for them at least. It was a grisly end for those two young men. She shook her head, pulling her mind back into focus. She headed back towards her room in the workshop. It had been a long night last night. Even though she was out for most of the night, she still felt tired. She set her gear down with a sigh. She stretched briefly, feeling stiff from the uncomfortable hospital beds. "Riona!" A voice called out to her from her workshop. Riona poked her head out of her doorway. She saw Seth standing in her workshop. Riona's face brightened when she realized it was him. He smiled as they made eye contact. "There you are," he said with fox exasperation. "Here I am," Riona said with a roll of her eyes. She walked down the stairs into her workshop. Her old friend looked her up and down. "You look like you've hardly slept." There was a hint of concern in his voice. "Thanks, so do you." Seth snorted at Riona's sarcasm. "Figured you were here since I couldn't find you in any medbay. A pretty lady's looking for you, by the way." Riona perked up instantly. Seth chuckled and shook his head. "Thought that would get your attention." Riona rolled her eyes. "So, who's looking for me exactly?" Riona asked. An emerging feminine voice responded with, "That would be me, Riona Kelly." A familiar woman stood in the doorway. She gave Seth a blank stare and then looked up at Riona. Seth gave a wave to Riona as he left to finish his reports on the events of the night before. "Take it you're here for business, then?" Riona asked as she headed down to the workshop. "Only reason for a military escort such as yourself to visit." Riona brushed her hair out of her eyes. "That would be correct." The escort nodded in response. "Don't think I caught your full name." Riona stayed with a slight tilt of her head. Riona smiled in response and nodded. "I'm guessing your little military did their homework on me." Nat nodded in response. "Figures. Well, what you got?" It has to do with that creature that attacked this outpost. Riona's smile dropped at the mention of it. Acer wants it dead, and R&D wants its body for study, Nat put simply. Riona squinted her eyes at the younger woman. That's all? As well as for some complicated tests. Are you in? She asked Riona, only half answering her previous question. Depends on how we're doing this. Riona turned her back to the escort. She opened her locker and put on her old trusty field jacket. We can get into details once we have everyone gathered. Riona hummed in response. How many others do we need for this? Nat looked up and thought. 3 to 5. We'll see how many we can get. What's the payout for this one? Standard payout? And then some. I'm in then. Nat smiled in response, surprised at her willingness to take on a contract without even having all the available intel. Not that she was complaining. One last question, Nat. How long are we planning on being out there? Just a few days. We'll get a resupply if it goes longer. We can head into town to find some other wayfinders. Riona nods in agreement. Just give me a few minutes to get everything in order, Riona stated as she tied her hair up into a bun. All right, I'll be waiting in the motor pool. Natalie walked out of her workshop, leaving Riona to her own devices. Riona walked up to her room to dig out her rucksack. This was going to take a bit. She packed her rucksack with her usual kit, careful to include enough water, as the water in the hazard zone was not potable, even as a last resort. Luckily, she still had a case of specialized MREs made for mutants like her. The envy of the normals. No evil cheese spread or vile wheat snack bread existed in the specialized MREs. She strapped a case containing her favorite armor set securely to her ATV's trailer. She reassembled her HK-416, sure to pack what attachments she needed: a suppressor, an ACOG with a mounted holographic, and an underbarrel grenade launcher. She grimaced as she looked at her rifle. She really had turned into a Geardo. If she wasn't mutant, she would have complained about the weight added to her rifle by the numerous attachments. She still had more packing to do. Riona secured the tarp to her trailer. Everything was in order. She was ready. She mounted up and turned on the engine for her ATV. She drove at a leisurely pace to the motor pool to meet up with Nat, who was fiddling with her gloves as Riona pulled up beside her. You have enough gear there? Nat glanced at her well-packed trailer. Riona shrugged in response. I like to be well prepared. Nat shrugged and mounted up on her own ATV. Where are we headed? To the Town of Perdition. Have to pick up a few extra hands for this. Riona nodded in agreement and let Nat pull it in front of her. The military escort led the way through the outposts. She did the usual sign-outs at the checkpoint, with Acer paying close attention to who went in and out after last night. The cedars and pines of the northwestern wilderness formed an impenetrable barrier on each side of the road. The drive was long and uneventful, almost peaceful. The Cascades were always beautiful at this time of year, even in spite of all the strange and otherworldly creatures that were never far away. She still felt a little safer here than in the old outpost. Maybe she was just a bit sick of being cooped up in there. That was very likely. Old road signs that once showed speed limits were now spray painted with their distances for different destinations. That strange gas station, the Town of Perdition, and a few other locations. Not much time had passed since the last time she had visited that strange town in Washington. And that was Chapter 3 of Tales from Perdition. I hope you enjoyed that. And as usual, good night, listeners. Good night.